According to Katrina Pearson, a national spokeswoman for Donald Trump's presidential campaign, his proposed ban on Muslim immigration is justified because any Muslim, quote, can just flip into a jihadist. But interfaith leaders have spoken out strongly about the backlash against American Muslims. The Council of Religious Leaders of Metropolitan Chicago recently issued a statement saying that such acts are contrary both to the teachings of our faiths and our high American values. To learn more about how people of faith are countering fear and violence, we welcome Tabassum Haleem, Executive Director of the Council of Islamic Organizations of Greater Chicago. We also welcome Reverend Deborah Rundlett, Transitional Executive Presbyter for the Presbytery of Chicago, which represents Presbyterian churches in the Chicago area. What do you see the root of fear of Muslims here in America?
It's a result of many different things. One is definitely the wars that we've seen over over a decade, and scenes of violence, our soldiers getting killed, the civilians getting killed. That has taken so much of the national dialogue. So that is already there. And then the news media, as much as some may even try to make it balanced, inevitably what makes the news is violence and not peace efforts. So there's a disproportionate attention being paid to the violent actions that are going around the world. And of course, some of them, unfortunately, are being perpetrated by Muslims or those who call themselves Muslims. And then, of course, there are some political opportunists who take that rhetoric or take those violent acts and use it for their own means to forward their own agenda. So all of those things culminate into an atmosphere where an average American may think that this is really what's going on most of the time and against Americans.
Are we seeing any of this discrimination and inflammatory remarks towards people here in Chicago?
Unfortunately, yes, in different forms. Several of our mosques have been vandalized and defaced. And also we're seeing it, unfortunately, with some of our youth, where children are being bullied by their classmates and saying unfortunate things, which other kids may not even realize, are hurtful. Even we've heard of incidents where friends of Muslim children make these, remarks jokingly, but that the kids are taking it very seriously. I've heard of one incident where a 7-year-old, right after the Paris attacks, goes to her parents and says, "Mom, do you think it'll help if I tell my friends I'm not a Muslim anymore?" So it's definitely a painful time.
I also think we are in a time of deep adaptive change. And when we're in that place where we're resistant to the shifts that are going on that we can't control, that we don't understand, then we want to pinpoint and isolate what we might be afraid of. And we have different responses to that. We freeze, there's flight, there's frenzy, and there's fighting, significant fighting. And so I think one of the places that we can work together in an interfaith context is learning how to manage polarities, learning how to live in the liminality of our time and the ambiguity, and understanding that we're coming to the end of a 500-year cycle, so that if we set it into a much broader context, we begin to see these patterns played out multiple times as you see 500-year cycles end. And to shift it from looking back to what was and trying to reclaim it, to living into the privilege of being able to lay the foundation, especially of our present moment, but also for the impact that will have living forward for next generations, and to broaden that picture. For those of us who are Christians, who are trying to figure out the context of our faith out of our core identity in Christ, I think we have to remember that Jesus used these very simple images and called us to be yeast and salt and light, which means we're not the whole loaf. We're not the whole mountain, if you will, but that we're a part of this, and that it's a partnership, and that together we can have a profound impact.
That brings to mind the Wheaton College professor who is reportedly being fired for saying that Muslims and Christians worship the same God. What is your reaction to that? And how do we get around that conversation?
That's a very interesting situation. So the position that the council has taken is that Wheaton College is within its rights to establish rules for its school and how it and the contractual terms that it has for its professors, and to live its faith, as an institution, as a community, to live its faith as it chooses to. On the other hand, and we certainly respect Wheaton College for that. On the other hand, we have also expressed great respect for Professor Hawkins for being so courageous in standing up for a vulnerable population right now, which is Muslim women, American Muslim women who identify themselves very publicly by wearing a scarf. So in expressing her support for them and putting herself out there in such a life-changing way. Many of us, we like to think that we stand up for our principles, but would we really put our jobs at stake, our livelihood at stake, our careers at stake for our principles and for people who are not part of our community? So the council has expressed great respect for Professor Hawkins as a Christian living out her faith. Because for us, that is our image of what Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him, taught, is to be that neighbor and be that friend to others.
And Deborah, what else is the Presbyterian Church doing to create more interfaith relationships?
So we work through the council together. In fact, that's how we met. We also have collaboration with many interfaith conversations, and so both internally and as a denomination, as well as in the city, seeking to look at ways in which we can move beyond what might be called a bounded set theology that has us looking inward to a formational theology that does not in any way deny that we seek to understand and know our core identity in and through Christ, and that our character is formed accordingly, and we find that call, but that in that gives us the ability to enter into conversations from a profound place of identity and to honor then the identity of others in their journey.
And personally for you, how has that strengthened your faith journey and working with our Muslim neighbors?
So I was born in New York City. I have never not been part of a community that has not been multiracial and multinational, and there is a deep richness to that, and it forces a clarity of thought too, and ownership for who I am. There was a wonderful commencement speech once given where there was the sense that we are to know ourselves in order to control ourselves, in order to give ourselves. And I think that there is much to be said then in terms of the intentionality of our journeys. Because just as I have never not known a multicultural community or been part of one, I've also never not known my God. So there has been this deep sense, abiding sense of God's presence in my life, which allows then for a journey shared.
And Tabassum, what would you say to some people who are fearful, especially after the attacks in San Bernardino, what we saw in Paris? We can go back to 9/11, which is still in our collective memory. How do we wrestle with that fear, but also being, in interfaith relationships?
I don't think that, I think the most important thing that we as Americans need to remember is that first of all, we're very privileged as Americans to live in relative peace for so many, for centuries, that there have been very few attacks on our homes, compared to what other countries go through. So we need to, as Americans, we need to put that in perspective. And then secondly, realize that we are privileged, again, to so much information from so many different sources. As a democracy and as a country where the right to information and the support that we have for free and independent media, that doesn't exist. We should not take that for granted. We should in fact take advantage of that to insist that we hear the truth from around the world and not let people spoon feed us information or spoon feed us propaganda. And then as people realize that yes, there's violence in the world, there's violence in the city. If we just try to understand where that comes from and not let people package it in a way that forwards their agenda, but we make the effort to understand where's that gang violence coming from? Where does terrorism come from? Why? And the first thing, I think one of the more important things we need to understand is how war, terror, and hate are all related. And we can't just, yes, we need to fight terrorism. Yes, we need to treat these criminals as criminals, but we also need to solve these bigger issues, like try to find solutions to these wars that are going on, and try to find the root of all this hate rhetoric that's going on, and stand our ground and say, as Americans, it is anti-American. It's against our values to be part of this hate-mongering campaign. Mm-hmm. And then when these stories are reported, be a critical reader. Think about, because in many stories, the media goes to some trouble to research what was behind the attacker's motivation. Was it mental illness? Was it a grievance against the employer? Or many other reasons why people become violent? Try to decipher one versus the other. If how soon after violence is committed by a person do you learn that somebody is a Muslim? Whereas if somebody else, another person, their religion is not named, why isn't it named? So let's compare apples to apples. And let's make sure that as readers, as consumers of media, that we're not being manipulated to believe in certain things that other institutions or other organizations want us to believe for their own agenda.
Right, and I know the Council of Religious Leaders in their statement said, calling out political leaders, find ways to welcome refugees and give up the urge to divide people for political gain. So how do you talk about the Syrian refugees, and what is the Presbyterian Church doing to make sure that refugees are welcomed here in the United States?
So we have spoken out on a national level through our stated clerk, Grady Parsons. And in fact, his statement provided a basis for us to begin to think about our statement as interfaith leaders here in Chicago. We've also, though, talked about the importance of nurturing one-on-one relationships because it is much harder to demonize a people if, in fact, you have relationships that humanize and nurture not only relationship but a shared sense of commitment to one's community and and that building, if you will, of shared mission. So our churches are very much committed and have addressed a letter to Governor Rauner and are opening up their houses of worship.
Maybe talk a little bit about how the Council of Islamic Organization is tackling the issue of the Syrian refugees and how we can welcome them to the United States.
We have been working with different refugee groups that are already that have always been focused on refugees, and then there are many Muslim organizations like the Islamic Circle of North America Relief. There's Islamic Relief Organization. So there are different organizations that provide services to the refugees. There's also social service organizations like the Arab American Family Services organizations. So what the council is trying to do is bring all these groups together so that they can streamline some of the services that are provided, and also help. And then that's one part of it. The other is to help the American people understand, what it means to be a Syrian refugee. Where they're coming from, what they're running away from, or what they're escaping. So, just because in order to alleviate fear, good information is always very helpful.
Yes, I always say what we don't understand is what we fear the most. Right?
Yes, absolutely.
Tabassum and Deborah, thank you so much for sharing and continuing this important dialogue and conversation with our interfaith brothers and sisters. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the privilege.
I'm Anne Marie Gerhardt for Different Drummers and the Greater Chicago Broadcast Ministries. Keep the faith.